The rapidly expanding use of APIs to accelerate application development and advance business services has created a vast constellation of interrelated services, now often called the API economy. Yet the speed and complexity of this API adoption spree has largely outrun the ability of existing tools and methods to keep tabs on the service's topology, let alone secure and resilient API production. We'll now explore in a deep dive interview the trends confronting businesses as they seek to fast track to new digital services. And we'll explore a new platform designed specifically to secure and optimize the APIs so that many developers and architects are counting on more and more today. Please, again, use the interface that you're viewing right now to add questions at any time during our interview. Sanjay and I will be there to address them at the end of our chat. Now, here's my interview with Sanjay. Sanjay, why is addressing API security different from previous vulnerabilities of traditional applications and networks? Why are we dealing with something new, and why do we need something new to head off the vulnerabilities?
If you just compare this to something as a house, as an analogy that way, which will kind of depict what the changes are, is like previously, let's say there was a single house with a single door, and you only had to protect the door to block someone from coming into the house. It was a lot more easier. Guess what? Now you just multiply that by saying there are multiple rooms in a house, and each of those rooms has an open window. That means that now the attacker, in any case, from a house perspective, can come in any of these windows rather than just a single door or a single opening into the house itself. So to now extend that analogy into what, as you were talking about, as an API economy is, as an API-driven businesses, most of the businesses today, you're right, are API-driven businesses. They expose APIs. They use third-party libraries, which are, again, connecting to other APIs. And then each of these APIs that are powering a business are also interacting with other internal APIs as part of the organization, and also third-party APIs that they're calling into. So it is APIs and services everywhere, as in microservices that are getting developed to actually power an entire application, which is then powering a business. So that's where it is getting complex compared to what used to be a typical network security or a basic application security solution, which would take care of the perimeter for a particular application and secure the business that way. Now extend that to all of these services and APIs. And when you look at network security, that kind of operates at a different layer, because the layer is a lot more static and has a very good understanding of what the network is set up as and what the different application components are deployed, where they're deployed, and everything else. Now, with code rapidly changing and services coming online all the time and APIs coming online all the time, there is no single perimeter that way, right? Similar to the housing as an analogy that way. So now, in this complex world where it is all APIs across the board, you have to take into consideration various aspects to understand what the security risk for your APIs are, and in turn, what your business's risk is when it comes to security. And that's what is making it very, very complex, where the older solutions, which used to take care of at a network security level or at a single application level by looking at the data at that single data point that comes in as part of these calls that are hitting the URLs, now have to take into consideration a lot more context in order to detect whether a particular piece of attack that is coming in is an attack of some type, or is it some form of an anomaly that is not necessarily malicious, but it is more like a reconnaissance type of an attack. So all of these things needs a lot more sophisticated solutions that, frankly, the industry hasn't caught up to, even though the developers and DevSecOps have moved a lot faster.
And of course, these are business critical services. And so we're talking about mission critical data that's moving among and between these APIs in and out of organizations across their perimeters. So this is not just a nice to have. This is, in fact, the reputation of your business and whether or not you're going to end up in a headline tomorrow because of some attack.
Exactly. Because at the end of the day, APIs are exposing the data in some shape to their business users. That means that the data that is flowing through may actually be part of the application. It may be actually coming from another B2B type of an API, or you may be taking the user's data and actually pushing it to a third-party service. We've all seen the attacks that have happened across the board in very sophisticated technology companies. And these are very hard problems that, as a developer myself, what I can tell you is what keeps me up most of the times is, am I doing the right thing when it comes to the functionality of my application? Am I doing the right thing when it comes to the overall quality of it? Am I doing the right thing when it comes to delivering the right kind of performance? Am I meeting the performance expectations of my users? And of course, I'm always thinking about, with what I do as a developer, thinking about the security of every single API that I'm writing, right? Because at the end of the day, it's the data that is getting exposed through these APIs. So for you to kind of understand how this data is getting used, how this data is getting passed around through internal services and third-party APIs is a lot more important now, because that's where lies the understanding of the risk associated with your API.
So given that we have a different type of security problem to solve, what was your overarching vision for making APIs robust and powerful at the same time? And what is it about your background that helped you get to this vision? What prepared you to come up with how you view the world should be?
If you dial back the clock in terms of what myself and Jyoti, who's my co-founder at Traceable, we built the product and company at AppDynamics. AppDynamics was at the forefront of helping developers and DevOps teams to understand their application's performance that way. So when the product started at that time, there was a very basic understanding of how your applications are actually performing and how that is getting delivered in terms of to the customers itself. And when AppDynamics started to think about this in a different way, one of the goals there was, how do you understand these applications from the ground up so that you can understand how these applications with the modules, that the sub-modules that you have and sub-services that you have, how are they interacting with each other? That basic understanding was required to kind of say, what is that end user experience that is being delivered with the performance aspects of it? And that gave rise to application performance management that way, in terms of understanding your application's performance itself. So from an AppDynamics perspective, it was very important for us to know how the services were impacting each other. That means that when a call gets made from a service A to a service B, you should be understanding how much time was consumed on the call that was happening between the two, and how much time was spent within the service itself, within each of these services, and how much time was actually spent delivering the data back to the user itself. This was all in the performance context. But one of the key things that we clearly knew as we started Traceable was that these APIs are exploding. As we talked about as an API economy, every one of the customers of Traceable that we started to talk to, they were clearly asking us, performance aspects of it and everything else is one side of it. We've been taking care of that in various ways by using other products. But how do we actually know whether these APIs and applications are secure? That's where we are having a difficult time, because as much as the developers like to make sure that APIs are more secure, they are unable to do it simply because they don't understand what it goes to securing these APIs. So can you help us actually solve that problem? That is where we started to think about, how can we bring some of the learnings that we have had in the past in terms of the DevOps involvement that we have had for a long time now, is how do we bring that understanding of APIs and services and start to think about application security in a new way? That's where we started Traceable to say, the best way that we can actually understand the applications and the interactions of the applications, understanding the users of these applications, is by using the technology which has been built over the last decade plus, is distributed tracing. By helping us trace the calls through from one service to another, we were able to take the data that was flowing through those services, understand the context of the data. Context of the data, when I talk about it, who are the users of these APIs? What is the type of data that is flowing through? Which APIs are interacting with each other? And which are the APIs that are getting called as part of a single user session, as an example? And which third-party APIs are these data being pulled from or pushed into? So this overall context is what we wanted to understand. And that's where we started to build this on a tracing technology, which we built, and we actually open source the technology so that DevOps users can use it for all kinds of tracing use cases, including performance and everything else. And that's an open source piece. We have a few customers who have started to use it now. But the goal for us was use that distributed tracing technology to go solve the application security challenges, which started with a lot of the customers, as I said, asking us, hey, I don't even know where my APIs exist. Developers seem to be pushing a lot of APIs, and we don't have an understanding of where these APIs are, how are they actually impacting our overall business in terms of security. What if some of these things gets exposed? What happens then? If we have to do a forensic analysis of these, what happens then? That is where the challenge for us was, that we wanted to go and say, let's deploy this technology to go understand these applications from the ground up, these APIs from the ground up. If the customers don't have an understanding of where the APIs exist and what the purpose of these APIs are, then they won't be able to secure it. So for us, the basic concept was, let's bring the discovery of these applications and APIs to play so that the customers can understand it. That's where we started first. And then based on that, we said, once they understand the APIs and they discover those APIs, let us go and understand what is the normal behavior of these APIs. Because one of the things that happens with most of the APIs is they get published out there, but there is a basic understanding of those APIs in the form of an open API spec or a Swagger spec. But if you talk to most of the enterprises, there is no record of some of those things, but also they're rarely maintained that way. And one thing that developers do very well, which every developer does it well, is to ship code. They ship good functionality. They try to ship bug-free code that way, and try to ship code that basically can perform well. They try to do all those right things. But also at the same time, the documentation aspects of it is where it gets weak, because they're continuously shipping. So because the code is changing continuously from a CI/CD perspective, the developers that way are not able to continuously keep the open API or a Swagger spec up to date in a lot of cases, especially as it continuously gets deployed into production. So one of the difficulties that we have heard from customers over and over again is that the developers try to do their job in making this current so that the security as a team understands it on a continuous basis, what the security as a risk posture is from a security perspective. But because it's not up to date, we just don't know. We're not part of the loop. So the whole DevSecOps as a movement that is coming together, where security practitioners are embedded as part of the developers teams and DevOps as a team itself, is great. So that means that now the security folks also have a continuous understanding of the security practices, but also ensuring the types of APIs that are coming online continuously. Now, the beauty of where the customers are expecting our solution that way to come together is to help them automate some of these things, help them automatically understanding the risk of these APIs and which APIs should be blocked from getting deployed into production, which APIs should be monitored a lot more. So the cycle of observing these APIs on a continuous basis becomes very, very critical. But this observation from our perspective was, once we build this understanding of these APIs, we discover these, we build an understanding of these APIs. Then we wanted to protect those APIs because APIs do get into production. And we have seen this over and over again. This is not about some company not having the technology richness or the engineering as in developers not having the right kind of training. We are talking about companies like Facebook, Shopify, and Tesla, and all these technology-rich companies having these issues because APIs are continuously evolving, and also there are siloed pieces of development because, as we were talking about earlier, microservices are using each other, APIs are using each other. That means that some cases they understand the dependencies, in a lot of cases they fully don't understand the dependencies of those of the services itself, and also the security implications because of those dependencies. This exposes a lot of different types of attacks now, as in business logic attacks. And Jyoti has talked about it in some of the previous conversations about it as well, as to why those are very, very critical, right? So these business logic vulnerabilities that way, how do you go protect them? So the discovery part of it is very key. Understanding the risk part of it is very key. Then on top of that, the protection aspects of it is very, very key. That was where we started. This is part of the vision that way that we started to build out. And once the protection aspects of it come in, because of the way the platform that we built out in helping all of these understanding, we wanted to expose this understanding to our customers as well, for them to go and hunt for different types of attacks that may be lurking as part of the system. Or it could be they are analyzing, because of the data lake that we have based on the data, they are analyzing not just prospective attacks, but help them in forensic analysis that way of all the different types of activities that are happening. This was the vision that we started with, is how do you go and bring in observability into application security? And that's what we built to basically help them evolve their application security practices that way.
So understanding your vision now, in order to avoid a fire hose of data and observability, how did you design the platform in order to move to that higher abstraction of value around automation and around intelligence? What was it that you wanted to bring to your platform that didn't just provide so much visibility that it almost became a handicap? How did you move to make it a value that lasts even as it scales?
One of the key aspects of building anything as a platform or as a solution there is to not just throw data at your customers. That means that you're collecting the data, you're just presenting that as in a data lake, and just allow them to be slicing and dicing and analyzing and doing a manual process. The goal from the get-go for us was to, in each of these areas for us, understand when we talk about discovering the APIs, we are talking about discovering the APIs and helping them categorize those in the right way. That means that we are able to kind of understand which APIs are externally facing APIs, which are the APIs that are internally facing, where is the sensitive data, most amount of sensitive data, the type of sensitive data that is getting carried through these APIs, who are the users of these APIs, what roles do they have as an API. So we are building a wealth of insights into how the APIs itself behave. This is what helps our customers to know what to focus on. It is not just about the data. Data forms the basis for all of these things, but it's not about presenting the data to the customers and saying, hey, go ahead and figure things out yourself, right? That was never the intention. The intention for us was, based on this data, what are the insights that we can capture to enable the security teams, the security and operations teams, and developers and DevSecOps as in teams itself to get the right kind of insights. That was one key tenet that we started building the product with, right? The second thing is that, which is related to that, is we very, very much know that the security and operations teams are swamped, and they are most of the times under budgeted in terms of the people itself. So from that perspective, for us, it was very important that the types of data that we present to those teams are very actionable. The types of protection that we do and the detection of anomalies that we do has to be very, very low in terms of false positives itself, because that is what drains some of these teams. right? So that was one of the key aspects of building it as well. The third one for us was from a DevSecOps team's perspective. How do you give them actionable data that can actually take them to have an understanding of the services that are getting deployed in a cloud native fashion and the code that is getting deployed as part of that? How do you kind of get to an understanding to that code level as to which are the ones that is making a database call to where the data is flowing, or which are the APIs that are actually making these third-party service API calls, to help them get that level of actionable information when it comes to vulnerabilities, when it comes to vulnerabilities in pre-prod or at runtime that way as we are detecting, to understand what the source of those vulnerabilities are. Where are they coming from? That was very, very important for us to go and manage, right? So we took some of these things very seriously as we were building the solution so that we can deploy our understanding of these APIs and build all of the AI ML on top of this data so that we can extract the right kind of insights out of it and make sure those are actionable insights for our users. That is the way we have been kind of building the platform from the ground up. Because one of the key things was, as we talked about, because of the CI/CD as an environment and how applications are getting deployed today, it's very important that we actually are continuously providing this to them. It is not just a matter of statically just saying, hey, here is your APIs, here is our insights on top of this, and here's where you should be focusing from a risk perspective and everything else, but also continuously enabling them to go and use the platform that way as these APIs are evolving and changing. One last thing that we set out to do as part of all of this was that the customers that we were talking to were in that part of the journey to microservices in some cases. So we had to basically provide the solution to diverse infrastructures that way, right? Observability and security for customers who are fully in a cloud native microservices environment, to other customers who are making their journey towards that from legacy monolithic applications and everything else. So we had to provide that bridge for them to get there. And that's what we started to build the platform based on.
And you've just released your platform, its first iteration in August. And now that it's in the marketplace, I'm seeing that you're providing a very strong value to the developer by helping them iterate and improve and catch mistakes by being able to see the vulnerabilities. And you're also helping the security operations teams because they can limit the damage when something goes wrong. You're showing them where those vulnerabilities are, but also how to close the damage, to stifle the damage. So it seems to me that by having those two constituencies and value to them, that you're actually probably bridging the gap between them, that there's a cultural assimilation between the developers and the security teams. Is that how you see yourself, and is that how your product in its first iteration is coming to market?
Absolutely, because I think you said it right. In a lot of cases, what happens as the organization starts to get bigger and bigger, and typically what is happening today from microservices-based API-driven development that way is that there are typically about 6 to 8 member teams that way that are building many pieces of functionality which eventually form an overall application, right? That is the case even internally at Traceable as well as we go build out the product and the platform. So in those cases, it's very important that there is an understanding of when a request comes in to your overall application, how does it actually translate through all of the different services that are deployed, which means that there are service owners which are part of these smaller teams that way, which are owning these services, and how are they interacting with each other to deliver a single customer's request. Because that has a huge impact on understanding what is the overall risk to the application itself. The overall risk in a lot of cases is based on a combination of factors which are driven by all of the APIs that are getting exposed through those applications, but all of the APIs that are actually interacting through these services and the data that's flowing through these services. So it's very, very important to get a holistic understanding of the application and the overall application infrastructure itself to make sure that you're delivering security at an application level. So it's no longer enough just to say one single silo is, yes, I am secure, I'm practicing all the secure coding practices, but how is your interaction with the rest of the organization itself? That is one of the key things that we set out with. And that's where it was very, very important for us to go build what we call it API intelligence that way, which builds the from the ground up, as I was talking about, based on the data that's flowing through. We build something similar to a Swagger or an OpenAPI spec from a format perspective, but it's much more advanced because there is a deeper understanding of the data itself. That intelligence actually now helps us, along with the insights that come from those, to help us actually say, hey, here's all the APIs that is getting used across your organization. Here's how they are interacting with each other. Here's how the data is flowing between them. Here is the third-party APIs that are getting accessed as part of those. So we get that holistic understanding, and I think that is very, very important because it's just not about some external APIs that are getting access. Because the larger the organizations, there'll be lots of internal APIs that are getting built and used as well in siloed teams in a lot of cases. So I've heard some customers come to me and say that my developers were shocked that there are so many of these internal APIs that were getting used. In some cases, they thought that they were deprecated APIs, or they never expected those APIs to show up as part of one single service. Those are all things which are going to what we built, and obviously it feels good to hear those things. And the next part of it there is based on that API intelligence is an understanding of the risk itself. And that is very, very important because once the developers understand the risk associated with a particular API, the way they go about protecting them is what will become very important then. That means that the vulnerabilities on those things are going to get prioritized. The vulnerabilities as in fixes are going to get prioritized the right way. The way that they actually protect these APIs and put the guards against these APIs will change, right? So that was a very important thing for us to kind of do based on that risk itself. Because at the end of the day, for us, the goal was to bring together developers and DevOps and security teams that way. Whether you want to look at that as a single team or separate teams, it doesn't matter. For an organization, they all have to work together to make it happen. And what we wanted to provide was a single pane of glass for them to see the same type of data that they all should be seeing.
Yeah, I really am impressed by that single pane that cuts across different roles and different cultures. But I also was impressed with the interface that allows you to drill down specific to the context of your role or your persona. Yeah. So tell me a little bit about how the drilling down ability within the UI gives the developer specifically an opportunity to sort of compress an understanding of what's going on in production and bring that knowledge back into pre-production for the next iteration.
So I think one of the key things that happens in any application development lifecycle that way, there are stages of development that you go through, and typically they start to get deployed as in dev, staging, and there could be QA and there could be prod that way. So as in pre-prod, lower environments that way, and then production that way. So one of the things that there's a chance that gets missed is to learn from the production data itself. That is one thing that we are trying to address here. Because what happens, and this is as much as a developer, I don't like to admit it, because I would like to think that all the tests that are being written in my pre-prod environments will cover all the cases. But the reality has always been that production, the way customers use the application, the way the applications get deployed is always different, right? And the type of data that flows through is always different, right? It is even more now because of API-driven applications. Because API-driven applications, the developer, when they wrote that API, has an intent of how that APIs get used, and most of the tests are actually mimicking that. But now if you give this API to third-party developers and actually users that way, in the case of security hackers as an example, they are able to see the same APIs that a developer sees, but also get an understanding of how the API logic has been built internally. That means that now the external users are able to get a lot more information, get the same information, but they're able to gain their own insights from the intent that they have of using that API. This is where it gets complex. That means that now what we wanted to do was, rather than treating production and pre-production that way as silos, the thought process is, how do we actually bring some of this production learning and production knowledge into improving your security posture from a pre-production system perspective, so that we know certain APIs are being used in one way, we understand the risks associated with these APIs. That means that we are able to present that from a pre-prod perspective as well, to bring that knowledge into pre-prod. Now, looking at the pre-prod systems, it means that the decisions can be done, which APIs need to be protected differently, which APIs need to be where the users are accessing certain APIs where they were not supposed to be accessing, so that you can put in the right kind of controls. I think the core part of it is bringing that understanding into a pre-prod environment. That's where we are starting. That means that they understand the risk a little bit better so that they can protect it better.
Right. So the good news is that it's got value in post-production, pre-production. It has value for the SecOps team, for the security team, for the developers. Yep. But that's also perhaps the bad news, because who is in charge of bringing the traceable platform, that newly released product, into the organization? Who signs the PO? Who are the people that should be most aware of this in order to make it so valuable, but across so many different aspects? It seems like that might be a little bit of a go-to-market challenge for you.
Yes, and so if you look at it that way, right, there are typically two types of organizations that way. It is no longer that there's only a case that there's a central security team which is making all the decisions. There are DevSecOps teams which are engineering driven that way, who are security conscious as well. So we are catering to both of them as users. That means that in our case, there are many of our customers where engineering leaders are making security their top priority as part of what they're doing. That means that the deployment aspects of it, when it comes to pre-prod and production, is part of their dev as a cycle. One of the things that we have done is make that entirely available as in a self-service, for example, to a lot of this thing. That's something that we are actually looking to launch in August, where we want to provide an easy way for developers and DevOps to actually come and download what we call as agents that way on onto their pre-prod and production systems that way, to make it part of their cycle itself. That is one thing that we are very heavily focused on, which will enable our customers to have a pretty easy deployment and go through that experience themselves, right? But the other class of it, where the security and operations teams have to go and convince the developers or DevOps to go actually deploy some of these things. There, of course, the experience is very, very important. That's what we've been successful with as part of our customers and everything else today. The other part of it is that the developers get the value because, as we discussed about the single pane of glass, it means that they are seeing the same information that the security teams are seeing. It is no longer about the security telling that, hey, there are these vulnerabilities, which is a problem, or there are these attacks that we are actually seeing, and the developers are looking at a different piece of data. Now, we are offering the same type of data by bringing in observability from a security perspective to offer the same kind of data to both sides of the equation in many of the customers where there is a central security team that way. So that's how we are managing this, Dana, by giving the developers and giving the security teams the tools that they need to get some of these things up and running pretty quickly, right? And the tools include not just the deployment aspect of it, but the understanding of these APIs and understanding of these risks, and bringing that knowledge from prod to pre-prod and pre-prod to prod that way. That's a very important cycle for them. Then giving them the same type of data where security and developers can make decisions based on the same type of data that they're looking at.
And of course, you're also taking advantage of the ability to enter into an organization through the open source model, where you have a free open source edition and you have your commercial edition that also invites people to customize, to experiment, to tailor it to their particular use cases, and then share that development back. So tell me a little bit more about how your open source approach works.
That's an excellent question. For us, one of the key things that we did, which we talked about a little bit before, was to go build a distributed tracing platform, which is needed for us to build all of the security use cases for us, because that formed the core component for how we wanted to bring in tracing and observability into security. So this tracing platform that we put out there as part of Traceable is what will enable the developers to go and adopt the tracing itself. But on top of that, we are also making it available, the free and open source part of it, where certain basic protections, the API discovery aspect of it, the risk understanding of it, and basic protection associated with securing your applications is available to everybody. Because our idea was that we wanted to democratize that way. If you look at it, Traceable, where we wanted to go and help the DevOps users to get this functionality of API observability and risk assessment that way, which our customers love today, the existing ones, is where we are launching basically a free edition and a team edition, which helps you get some of the functionality that our existing customers are getting. That means that as DevOps teams, you're able to kind of understand your APIs and the risk associated with it, and enable basic protection on these APIs as well, right? So that's what we're very excited about from a go-to-market perspective. But actually, the engineer in me, the thing that excites me is that we are a heavy open source user on our end, and also we are making a lot of our source available that way to people to go build solutions on top of it and use it in their own environments, so that at the end of the day, the developers are able to solve their business problems, because we are in the business of helping them solve security problems, and they are in the business of solving their own businesses, whatever they're working on. So for us, it is about how do we secure their APIs, how do we help them understand their APIs, discover them, and understand the risk associated with them, with those APIs. And that's what is our core, and we're putting it out there to developers and DevOps teams to use it.
Well, we're almost out of time, Sanjay, but going back to your vision, and the rather large task you set out for yourselves, as Traceable becomes embedded in organizations, is there an opportunity for the API economy to further blossom, or is there a risk of the API economy being stifled if those security and performance issues aren't dealt with? So I guess the question is how big an impact do you expect to have over the next few years, and how important is that for not only the API economy, but the whole economy?
From an API economy perspective, it is basically thriving because of the robust use of these APIs and reuse of some of the base services that get built as part of it. And I think I agree with you that anytime we hear a news about some API getting hacked or some data getting lost, then there is always that immediate inclination that way to say, hey, let's go stop the code from shipping, or let's go not ship too many features, or let's make sure that it is secure enough before it ships. That means that from a continuous delivery, which is powering the API economy that way, it's just not going to work, right? That means that we as a community of developers that way, if you look at it, we have to now come up with ways of ensuring that from a security and privacy perspective, we need to ensure the security and privacy so that we can continue to maintain the pace of continuous SDLC that way, because otherwise that will stall that way. And what I like to say is challenges that way will only get bigger that way, because the APIs are here to stay, the API economy is here to stay, and the APIs will be continuously evolving, and they will be delivering more and more functionality on a continuous basis. That means that the only way we can get better at this is by bringing in technology. Of course, like ourselves, I would like to say, but technology that way, which can enable the continuous delivery of the code, but also make sure that they are secure from a pre-prod perspective, pre-prod understanding perspective, but from a runtime perspective as well. And that's what the goal from our perspective is, to build that long-term and viable solution for enterprises.
Well, very good, Sanjay. Thank you so much for sharing your perspective. We're now going to take some questions from our audience, and I do encourage you all to continue to include those questions using the interface that you're looking at now. Sanjay, are you ready for a few live questions?
Absolutely.
All right, here we go. We have a first one asking, what if I already have access to a list of APIs in my organization? What else do I need to be concerned about in order to get a handle on API security?
Yeah. So I think if the access to that list of APIs was static in some fashion, I think it's great. One of the real challenges is that code is continuously evolving, as we talked about just now. That means that there is more and more code that is coming online and APIs that are coming online on a regular basis. So I was talking to a financial institution recently, and they have across their, what to say, thousands of services that they have, APIs that they have are continuously evolving, and they don't have a static list that exists today. That means that they're looking to say which of these APIs are changing. First of all, which of these APIs are external APIs, which are the APIs that are actually internal APIs. For them, first of all, to implement any kinds of policies on top of it, or to understand what types of activity happens on those APIs, they need to first of all discover those APIs. They need to understand which APIs are actually changing. Which of them, for example, APIs, as they're always exposing some form of a sensitive data, there is risk associated with it. Which are the ones that are actually unplanned, as in public APIs or internal APIs that way. And then if there are specs that they have, for example, which are conforming to a security standard that they have, how do they know that in the production environments, theoretically what is supposed to be implemented from a pre-prod perspective is actually running differently from a prod perspective, as the APIs got developed and APIs changed along the way? And then how do they understand what are the dependencies between the services itself? And when something gets some of the interactions of the APIs changes, then how do they understand what is the impact to the publicly exposed APIs itself? Last but not the least, how do they actually kind of understand who owns these APIs? If there are security issues or security reviews that need to be done for these dynamically changing APIs, what is the ownership looking like? So it's much more broader than having a just a basic understanding of the APIs, especially if the APIs are continuously changing and the risk is evolving.
As a follow-up from myself, it almost seems that we need a rating service, a certification capability where people could put their APIs through some sort of a test, maybe using something like Traceable AI behind the scenes. And then when they get vetted and certified, they could then post that and use that to get more interaction and trust.
Absolutely. So one of the things that we have as part of the product itself that way is, and which again, in general, as a technology like we were talking about, that's very relevant, is how are these, first of all, what are these APIs? How are they actually presenting themselves, either public or internally? And are they actually what are the risks that are associated with it? So the risk scoring system itself, there is a scoring that is needed, which is, again, OWASP has some of these things as well, as in, like, you're looking at a likelihood of an attack on an API and what is the impact if an API is attacked. There's a whole bunch of factors that we consider, close to 40 to 50 different factors that we consider to understand what is the overall risk based on the data that is flowing in, what types of vulnerabilities exist in the APIs itself, what is the business criticality, which are some of the things that are inputs from the user itself about those APIs. Combination of all of these things, you're right, needs to be considered to understand what is the risk of these publicly exposed APIs with the type of data that they're exposing, and to what data points are they connecting as the data flows through this APIs and services itself, and to understand what are the types of users who are accessing those. A combination of these, you're right, needs to be considered to come up with a risk scoring system which actually helps them identify which APIs to prioritize in terms of protection, but also which APIs to fix from a developer's perspective.
Right. All right, here's another question from our audience. How can data privacy and fraud use cases be best handled, particularly when it comes to cloud native applications?
Yeah, so see, one of the challenges is before, if you look at it, there was a single perimeter to say, okay, if I protect the APIs that are exposed getting here, exposed at this level, then as in an edge gateway, then we could actually protect a lot of the sensitive data from leaving the system, right? But when you look at the modern cloud native applications that way, most of them are distributed in nature. That would mean that there is a lot of interactions that are happening at runtime that you need to build that knowledge in order to understand what is the overall function of that application itself. That means that which APIs are interacting with each other, which data is actually going from one API as an external API to an internal API, and then to third party services, as an example. So you need to understand that entire flow in order to detect if a fraud is happening, at what level is the fraud happening, and how is a fraudster, I guess, is coming through those APIs and accessing the data, and what type of data is going out, right? And now, if you look at that's from a data exfiltration perspective, when you look at the fraud use cases itself, data exfiltration, as in the data privacy aspects of it and everything else, when you look at the fraud aspects of it for an API itself, there are many, many cases where those APIs from a business perspective can be understood by a hacker. And similarly, a product needs to, at runtime, understand these interactions of the APIs and how the users and at what data, at what level of data the APIs are accessing the data itself, right? And that is very relevant to take the user context, because the same API could be used by n number of users or categories of users in different ways, where the data that is being sent as part of that plays a big role. That means that the fraud can occur at any of these APIs and associate with any of these users or the roles that the users are associated with. So that's where it's very important that you have a full-on understanding to detect these.
All right, we have time just for one more question, I'm afraid. The question is, what is the difference between API vulnerabilities and regular web vulnerabilities? So I guess comparing the past to the present and future.
Yeah, so like if you look at, I mean, there are lots of vulnerabilities that have carried over from a typical web application perspective into the APIs as well. There are, in a lot of cases, even today, we see remote code execution type attacks or SQL injection type attacks that still come up. They're getting less and less because APIs are getting built in a different way, but at the same time, they still exist. But the real challenge here is that, with the as we have discussed before, what used to happen from web applications, where all of the business logic used to run behind a web page, as in behind the web services itself, to be only only the UI to be exposing the final rendered page that way. Today the APIs are getting exposed directly to the outside world. That means that the attacks like the IDORs of the world, or the BOLAs of the world, which is the authorization bypass type of attacks, or the cases where there are mass assignment type attacks that are happening, those cases are very, very hard to detect, especially in a distributed services nature. They're very hard to detect. That means that is where you need, because the data is actually flowing from one API, which is part of a one service, and the API on another service. It means that the interactions need to be tracked. It's no longer enough just to look at a single data point that flows into a web URL, so to say, and say there is an attack, which is how typical injection patterns are. Here you're talking about data that flows from one API to another. That means that you need to have the context of where the data is relevant and what users are actually accessing it. So if you have to detect such vulnerabilities, you have to have a much broader context, which we have discussed about before, around the users, the APIs, the data, and the code that's actually executing. This is where it is getting more and more complex. And now on top of this, the protocols are continuously evolving, as in GraphQL APIs, in gRPC APIs, and RESTful APIs. And so that means even ignoring all the legacy ones, which is the SOAP and everything else that way, right? Because of those reasons is where API vulnerabilities are a lot more complex than what the regular web ones are.
Well, very good. I'm afraid we'll have to leave it there. You have been an essential part of this discussion, exploring a new platform designed specifically to define, manage, secure, and optimize APIs. And this has been sponsored by Traceable AI. Please go to Traceable AI's website, where you'll find many more resources on API security, including news about APIs, or Traceable rather, is their free open source options and new platform iterations for tracing and observing your API use. You'll also find podcasts, blogs, how-to materials, and much more. Lastly, stay tuned for our next webinar discussion, this time with a user of Traceable AI's platform, to gather and understand their experiences in making APIs across their life cycle more resilient. Meanwhile, this presentation will be available on demand, so please tell your community that they can access it too. Lastly, let me conclude by thanking our guest. We've been here with Sanjay Nagaraj, Chief Technology Officer and co-founder at Traceable AI. Thank you so much, Sanjay.
Thank you.
And a big thank you as well to our audience for joining this presentation. I'm Dana Gardner, Principal Analyst at Briefings Direct. Thanks again for joining. Please come back next time, and hope you have more safe journeys across your software development arc. Goodbye for now.